There are some individuals whose engagement with the world appears like on the surface, it'll be really marked by this sense of humility, sensitivity, care, and they'll often speak gently and present themselves as thoughtful and appear to empathize with various perspectives, even those that seem contradictory. But beneath this soft exterior here, there's something more calculated that's often at play. So their worldview isn't built on a foundation of this truth-seeking or a sense of moral coherence, but it's rather on the preservation of control, particularly over emotional narratives. So their lens isn't governed by clarity, but by it's a kind of strategy. And they may seem adaptable, open-minded, and their flexibility is not born from this sense of true openness, but it's from this kind of need to remain in a position of perceived inner or interpersonal advantage. So at times, these individuals seem to advocate for the marginalized here, like, right, the misunderstood, or even those who have caused harm. They might defend the one who betrayed trust, lied, or manipulated, appearing to extend this kind of empathy toward them. But it's so convoluted, and it's not the kind of empathy that really heals or liberates here. That's why it's always kind of confusing. It's empathy wielded as a tool. It's weaponized. It's measured. It's strategic, and it's used to subtly destabilize another's clear sense of right and wrong. So it's like the defense of the villain, right? So to speak. It's not rooted in compassion, but in alignment with these behaviors that resonate more closely with I guess say thoughts or their unconscious patterns. So by siding with the one who has caused harm, they maintain the illusion of this kind of moral superiority, right? They say, see how understanding I am, how forgiving, how wise, how thoughtful I am. But this understanding doesn't include the actual pain of the one who is harmed. It dismisses, it distorts, and it even shames it sometimes. So in truth, it's not understanding at all. It's performative. It's a performance. So the emotional softness they display in these kinds of moments is less about connection and more about preserving image. It's an emotional theater where appearing balanced or fair is more important than being true. So they may play the role of the peacemaker, the philosopher, the one who sees all sides, but they never really arrive at any kind of justice or clarity. And it seems like they quietly erode it, though. So this often leaves others very confused, invalidated, and doubting their own experiences. And when someone comes forward with truth, pain, or boundary, it's not uncommon for it to be subtly questioned, rerouted, or reframed. Not to heal, but to disarm. Not to understand, but to dilute. So the most disorienting part is that this performance is rarely conscious. So these individuals are not typically aware that their empathy is conditional, that their neutrality is self-serving. Okay, it all comes back to them, their emotional states, how they feel, what they want, how people need to be more compassionate or empathetic towards them and individuals like them. So their softness conceals this desire to maintain control, and they're not lying, right? They're living in a lie. one that was likely built a long time ago in this kind of effort to survive, to be loved, to avoid being seen in their own naked truth. So when we engage with such a person as this, it's often we encounter this kind of hall of mirrors. We see all these reflections and distortions, but really little substance. There's very little substance that is actually involved. If very little words, like when they speak words of care, the body doesn't resonate with the truth of that care, right? Their concern may point in all directions, but never land in the actual heart of the matter, right? They never really get to it. And they can, like, how do I put this? Champion forgiveness, right? While sidestepping accountability. They can call for balance while all the while subtly shifting blame. So these dynamics aren't evil at all. They are harmful. And they're not malicious in intent, but they're devastating in their impact. So they lead others to question themselves, right? To lose touch with their inner compass, to mistake gaslight for insight. But behind the performance is a person, okay? One who is often terrified of real vulnerability, of not being the one who appears wise, calm, or in control. There's this deep fear of being truly seen, right? Of not having the upper hand in subtle emotional exchanges. It's very sad. And this is why direct confrontation rarely works. The individual won't recognize the mirror held before them. They'll simply call it distorted and retreat further into roles that they've rehearsed so well. And the only way to remain anchored in the presence of this kind of behavior is to return inward to your own truth, your own clarity, and your own felt sense of integrity. No explanation, no emotional gymnastics, nor performances are needed here. Only presence. And from the lens of Ayurveda and Vedic counseling, these emotional patterns, they don't emerge in isolation. They're the outer expression of these inner balances, both physical and subtle. So the body-mind system, they're governed by these three doshas, which are Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. So these become the field upon which our thoughts, perceptions, and behaviors are expressed or manifested. So when these energies are disturbed, particularly in manas, or the mind, we see distortions in clarity, empathy, and self-awareness. So in the personality described above, we're witnessing this complex interplay of imbalanced Vata and Kapha, often with subtle Pitta distortions just kind of woven in there. So Vata in the mind, which is Prana Vata and Vyana Vata, is disturbed movement and identity fragmentation. So the primary disturbance lies in the Vata dosha, especially in the mental realm. So Vata governs movement, subtle perception, and the processing of all these thoughts, because that's also movement, right? So when out of balance, it creates instability, this fragmentation of sense of self and identity, and an excessive identification with roles or personas, okay? So the individual becomes untethered from their authentic self, and instead they cling to these shifting emotional postures that provide this temporary safety or temporary security here. So this creates a mind that's anxious underneath and guarded, right? Sensitive, but unable to be truly still. And they can tell themselves their mind is still, but their behaviors and actions and the way they move through life is definitely not still. And this constant motion of thought leads to this over-analysis, projection, and a reliance on performance rather than presence. Words are used like wind here, right? Constantly shifting to maintain control rather than to express this true inner stillness. So Kapha in the mind, this is Tarpaka Kapha, it's attachment to persona and resistance to change. So this Kapha dosha, when it's imbalanced in the mind, leads to this emotional stagnation and excessive attachment to identity here, and this deep-seated resistance to change. So in this case, it manifests as a clinginess to the persona of the kind, fair, or emotionally intelligent, or even if this role is rooted in truth here. And this creates a subtle kind of this stubbornness, this refusal to see clearly, because seeing clearly would require the dismantling of a carefully curated image. And there is a softness on the surface, but a density beneath it that refuses to move or evolve. So this Kapha imbalance also lends itself to these emotional suppression, which, when combined with the hyperactivity of Vata, it creates this tension between what wants to be expressed and what must be concealed. So, right, the person lives in this subtle state of this self-denial. So we also see this Pitta distortion, and this is Sadhaka Pitta, misuse of intellect to justify control. So in a more nuanced cases, this distortion of Pitta can also be involved, and particularly the Sadhaka Pitta, which governs the intellect or ego processing of all of these emotional experiences. So rather than using the discriminating mind or the buddhi for self-inquiry and clarity, it's used to it rationalizes and defends all of these unconscious patterns. So this leads to the intellectualization of emotions, where empathy becomes this concept rather than a felt experience. So it's fire. Instead of illuminating, it's used to subtly burn the perspective of others under the guise of this insight or this kind of fairness here, right? So the way that we go about this and to restore is moving through the path of sattva. So healing these patterns is not about blame, but about restoring sattva, the quality of clarity, lightness, and truth in the mind. And from an Ayurvedic and Vedic counseling view, the return to balance begins with this grounding Vata through consistent routines, warm foods, present-based meditation, and connection to the body. So we mobilize the stagnant Kapha by encouraging emotional honesty, releasing attachment to fixed identities, and introducing the fire of sincere self-inquiry. And we want to purify this distorted Pitta by shifting from control to surrender and using the intellect not to justify, but to serve the heart. And it's not a quick path. It requires this courage. And it's this courage to dismantle the persona, to face one's inner contradictions, and to let go of control. But in doing this, the individual begins to access this deeper truth. That's what they need to do. And it's one that needs no performance, no mask, and no manipulation. And in this light, what appears as manipulation is often a soul's, the individual's, quiet cry for connection. It's a longing to be loved as they are, not as the role they perform. And the path forward is not to punish, but to illuminate, so the Atman or soul can just find its way home. Namaskar.